Good Erev Shabbos to everyone. I'm coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia. This is the city of the almost All-Star game for the Major League Baseball this year, but unfortunately the game has been moved from Atlanta going to some other city in the United States. I'm here visiting my daughter and son-in-law. We call her Dolly. Her name is Chaya and Yeruchim, and their two beautiful children, Meir and their newborn Leah Rivka. So I'm here for Shabbos visiting with my family. I want to thank the sponsors for Kiddush this Shabbos. We have Tom and Talia Block that are sponsoring. This is in honor of Don, their father's birthday. It's also in honor of their birthday, the birthday of their grandson, Gavriel Shlomo. Also sponsored by Fred and Joni Lavelle. This is in honor of Fred's mother's yard site, which is going to be on May 10th. His mother-in-law's yard site, Betty Heller, who I've known, so when I first came out here in 1981, a wonderful woman. Her yard site is on May 13th, and Fred's sister's birthday on May 16th. It's also sponsored by Lawrence and Debbie Michelson. This is in honor of the victims of Maron, specifically Nachman Daniel Morris, son of Tzvi Aryeh, and Michelson's are sponsoring in their memory. Just want to get a thumbs up from those that I can see that you're able to hear me because I'm using different equipment. Thank you very much. The sermon today may go a little bit longer than we normally allot to it. We're going to focus on a very special day on the calendar. Tomorrow, it's exactly 54 years ago that something extraordinary took place. The Jewish nation experienced a miracle of biblical proportions. Now, we always ask the question, how come miracles that took place in the Bible don't happen for us today? Maybe the question is really different. Are we opening our eyes and recognizing that miracles are happening? So I want to put this into context by first giving you a brief history, just backing up a few years from 1967. We're going to go to Friday, the 5th of the month of Iyar, which was May 14th of 1948. Israel declares itself an independent state, and immediately it's plunged into a war as 5 neighboring Arab states attack them. Immediately. Little Israel, which, keep in mind, this is 1948, had no heavy artillery, they had no tanks, they had no airplanes, and they had to defend themselves against Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. To understand the numbers of this war, there were 600,000 Jews against 45 million Arabs. You understand these numbers? 600,000 versus 45 million. And the United Nations did absolutely nothing. Now, Israel won that war, but the victory was bittersweet. The War of Independence lasted 13 months, and some 6,000 Israeli soldiers died. That was a full 1% of the Jewish population of Israel at that time. To understand again, using statistics, what those numbers represent, if that happened in America, that we lost 1% of our population in a war, that would mean 3 million people would have died. So understand how big that number was for this small country. The War of Independence was Israel's costliest war. And it is in that war that the old city of Jerusalem, including the Jewish quarter and access to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, fell to the Jordanians. The Jews were driven out of the old city. Their homes and all the synagogues were looted and destroyed. Even though the Jordanians signed an agreement that would allow Jews access to the Western Wall and to the cemetery on the Mount of Olives, they never listened to the agreement, and no country and no United Nations enforced the agreement, and they barred Jewish access to these sites. And they desecrated thousands of tombs on the Mount of Olives. Now let's go to 1967. The Arab countries did not easily accept their defeat in 1948, and all the while from 48 and on, they're plotting a comeback. And on May 22nd, 1967, Egyptian President Nasser declares the Strait of Tiran, that is Israel's sea access to Eilat, closed to all Israeli ships and any other ships bound for Israel. So it's a blockade. This was an attempt at economic strangulation, which can be considered an act of war to any other country. But initially, Israel didn't react. They were looking for a political solution. In the meantime, Nasser becomes more and more aggressive in his verbal attacks on Israel. May 27th, 1967, he declares that our basic objective is, and he says it openly, the destruction of Israel. June 1st, 1967, Iraq's president declares, our goal is clear, to wipe Israel off the map. There was no doubt, there was no confusion as to what the goal was of these Arab countries. Egypt and Syria form an alliance, combining their armies. And now Egypt makes a similar agreement with Jordan. It's all going to be one army. It was clear. War was coming. The war drums were being pounded away. Which brings us to June 5th, 1967. It's the 26th day of the month of Iyar on the calendar. That's tomorrow. Israel, realizing that the entire Arab world is about to attack, they launch a preemptive strike. It was one of the most brilliant preemptive strikes in history. In one fell swoop, Israeli planes bombed the entire Egyptian Air Force while still sitting on the ground. In just 6 days, Israel captured huge pieces of territory, and they won what is generally considered to be one of the greatest military victories in history. I think we're still fighting in Afghanistan from 9/11. This is 6 days, 6 days. This small Jewish homeland quadrupled in size in 6 days. In the south, they take the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. In the north, the Golan Heights comes back to us, which was occupied by Syria. In the east, the West Bank of the River Jordan, including ancient Judea and Samaria, including the holy city of Hebron, where the graves of our patriarchs and matriarchs and the resting place of our mother Rachel in Beis Lachem comes back into our hands. But the most stunning and incredible victory of that war was completely unexpected, even after the war began. And that's that Israel recaptures the old city of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount, the old city of Jerusalem and the Western Wall. And that happens 54 years ago. Before we tell the story as to how this came to be, I want to digress, but follow what I'm saying. It's important. I want to share with you a talk given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe months prior to the Six-Day War, and you'll see the connection. Judaism's most acclaimed poet is King David HaMelech. He wrote the book of Psalms, and in the book of Psalms, in the 147th Psalm, he says, Boinei Yerushalayim Hashem, the Lord is the builder of Jerusalem. Nitchei Yisrael Yechanes, he will gather the scattered of Israel. That's what King David writes. And he seems to be communicating this prophetic and comforting message of hope to a worn out, beleaguered nation, a people that have walked every valley of pain and tears and is still waiting for the light at the end of the tunnel. So King David is promising us of a day that God will gather us all in Jerusalem and eternal bliss will reign. Yet when he talks about God building Jerusalem, he uses the present tense. God is building Jerusalem presently. But then when he talks about the ingathering of Israel, he switches and he employs future tense. Again, listen to the words. God is the builder of Jerusalem, present. He will gather the scattered Jews. So why the change? So there's a medrash on this verse, and the medrash says the following. Despite the fact that God builds Jerusalem, nevertheless, he will gather the scattered of Israel. Now that doesn't answer the question, it just confuses me more. What's the meaning of the statement of the Medrash? Why would he think about building Jerusalem but not gathering the exiles of Israel? If he's rebuilding Jerusalem, it's because we're all coming back. That's the purpose of building Jerusalem. So what does it mean that even though he's going to build Jerusalem, he's still going to gather the scattered of Israel? And this is the beauty of the Rebbe's explanation. The Rebbe says, first let's study a piece of Talmud together. So I'm saying that to all of you. We're going to study a piece of Talmud, a piece of Jewish law. It's part of the tractate of Baba Metzia regarding home ownership disputes. The brilliance of the civil code of the Jewish people of the Talmud. Here's the law. Follow me, please. There were two condominiums built one on top of the other. Okay? So you have a duplex, one condo on the bottom floor, one condo on the second floor, two different owners. You have it all the time. So let's give them names. Harry owns the bottom condo. Jack owns the top one. So far, so good? You with me? Shake your head if you're with me. There we go. Okay. A hurricane comes and destroys both condominiums. What does Jewish law dictate regarding the rebuilding of the condominiums? Who's responsible to build them? Harry or Jack? And the answer in the Talmud is straightforward. Each one rebuilds their condo. Harry goes first. Why? Because he has the bottom condo. And he has to rebuild his condominium, including his walls and his roof. And Jack then will go and rebuild the top condo, and he'll have permission to use the roof of Harry's as his floor, because prior to the hurricane, that was the setup. They shared a two-story condominium, one on the bottom, one on the top, and therefore we're just going to repeat it. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing. So far, so good. It's pretty simple. But the Talmud doesn't leave anything in simplicity. What if Harry says, the one that owned the bottom condo, I'm not interested in rebuilding? What's Jack supposed to do? He's the upper condo. How can he build an upper condo without the lower condo? Unless he knows how to build castles in the air, he's got a problem. So the Mishnah says, this is the law. If a house and its loft belongs to two people and it fell in some type of hurricane or whatever type of event took place. Now, the one who owns the loft wants to rebuild it. The upper story wants to rebuild it. But when he tells the owner of the lower home to rebuild, he says, no, I'm not rebuilding. I'm moving out of here. In this case, the owner of the loft of the upper stair condo on the second floor, he's allowed to build his house on the ground floor. And he can live there until the owner of the ground floor comes back to him and says, I changed my mind. I want my place back. You're living in my place. Now what happens? He's able to say to him, no problem. Pay me all my expenses that I put in to build your condo, and I'll sell it to you, and then I'll build mine on the upper floor. Again, so far, so good. So when Jack, the owner of the upper condo, requests from Harry, the owner of the ground floor condo, to rebuild his condo so that he can rebuild as well, and Harry refuses, he says, I'm not interested. He's allowed to build downstairs, and if one day the guy changes his mind, he can say, pay me. If you pay me everything that I put out, I'll give it to you, you'll keep it. Of course, you can add the expenses, that the time that he put in, the effort that he put in to build, all of that is taken into consideration. And then he'll build his upper story condo. Every law in Judaism, every law in the Talmud, as technical, as earthly as it gets, has a deeper spiritual meaning. And this is true even involved when we're dealing with real estate legislation. So what's the deeper meaning of this law of the two condos? And here's the brilliance of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. There is a cosmic condo of the world. It's called Jerusalem. It's the world's finest condo. It's the spiritual epicenter of the universe. It's the central nervous system. What makes Jerusalem the center of the world? The fact that above it there exists an upper condo. There's an upper condominium. Most places in the world are one-floor condominium locations. They're earthly terrains. Jerusalem, on the other hand, is unique because that is a city where heaven and earth converge into a seamless whole. Why is Jerusalem so holy? Because it is situated right underneath where heaven and earth touch. So Jerusalem, the city below, is connected to the Jerusalem to heaven above. There's a higher spiritual Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is this double family complex. There's lower Jerusalem and there's higher Jerusalem. The Jerusalem that we love so much, that we travel to, that we sing the songs, is the earthly Jerusalem. That's where the Western Wall is, the Temple Mount is. Right above it is where God resides. And it parallels directly above the lower Jerusalem. The Jewish people live in the Jerusalem below in the lower condo, and right above them, God lives. He has his condominium in the higher condo. And for many years, we lived together beautifully. As two close neighbors, we took care of each other. We served God. God took care of us. Everyone made sure the other one's needs were met, right? We served God in Jerusalem. He took care of us. He shielded us. He provided for us. Like with every tenant, there were issues. There were some ups and downs. There were some disagreements. There were some arguments. But despite the challenges, the divine presence dwelt amongst the children of Israel, the people of Israel in Jerusalem. But then times changed. Exile came. Jerusalem was besieged and conquered, and the Jews were forced into exile. The lower condominium was destroyed on the 9th day of the month of Av, and both temples in the city of Jerusalem were destroyed on that day. The first was destroyed in the year 586 BCE by the Babylonians, and the second in the year 70 CE by the Romans. The lower condominium was up in flames. But it wasn't only the Jews who were evicted. God, too, was sent into exile. The higher condominium was also destroyed. In the words of the Talmud, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, followed the Jews into exile. God and the Jews were painfully evicted from their homes, and they began their wandering journey. The Talmud and the Zohar teach, and I quote, "The Holy One, blessed be He, took an oath that He would not re-enter Jerusalem above until He can enter Jerusalem below." God would not return to His abode in the higher condominium as long as we didn't return to the lower condominium. In that sense, it's like a physical upper condo where you cannot go and live there as long as the lower one remains desolate. You have to rebuild the lower one first. The owner of the loft asks the owner of the ground floor to rebuild so that he can rebuild as well, the upper tenant. God asks us to rebuild the lower house. He wants us to rebuild Jerusalem, because that will allow him to rebuild higher Jerusalem. And he beseeches us by means of divine inspiration and heavenly whispers to reconstruct the city of gold, the city of light, to recreate a fragment of heaven on earth. God asks the Jewish people to once again serve as his ambassadors, to turn their lives and their world into an abode for the divine, to become again that kingdom of princes and a holy nation, infusing their entire beings with holiness, with truthfulness, with godliness. But his words didn't always find their mark. Despite God's whispers, since Jerusalem was decimated, we've never completed our renovations. The world still remains hungry for the true Jewish revolution to transform our planet, and for each of us to become that ambassador of God, an ambassador for love, an ambassador for light, an ambassador for hope. So the owner of Jerusalem above begs and pleads with us, the owners of Jerusalem below, And we seem to refuse to rebuild. God waits and waits, but at some point he is too pained to wait any longer. He wants to go home. He wants to be there with his children, so he decides to recreate Jerusalem on his own, to bring himself and his children back to Jerusalem. He doesn't want to wait for the lower tenant to wake up to rebuild the lower condo. So he initiates the process. God himself initiates the process. This is what the Rebbe is talking about months before the 6-day war, that God is getting tired of the wait and he will initiate the process. Remember these words. God will initiate the process because it's time to rebuild Jerusalem. Months later, Jerusalem was given to the Jewish people. And if you know the history, and I'll give it to you briefly today, it was literally forced upon them. They received back their holiest city, almost kicking and screaming that they don't want it. For 19 years, since 1948, no Jew was allowed to visit the Western Wall. You're aware of that. Many of the soldiers fighting the war had not been born yet when this site was lost to the Jewish people. So the soldiers in 1967 didn't even know, they never saw the Western Wall. They only saw pictures of it. They never saw it in real life. Now, initially, Jordan was reluctant to enter the war. Egyptian President Nasser used the obscurity of the first hours of the war. He lied to the people and to the world to convince the Jordanian King Hussein that Egypt was victorious on that first day of the war. He never let it be known that his entire air force was wiped out literally in the first minutes of the war. So the Egyptians controlled their radio and they're broadcasting that we've achieved tremendous victory. Judaism, the Jewish people are being crushed. Israel is being crushed. The Jordanians are hearing this and they don't want to be left out. If all of the Israel is going to be up for grabs, they want a piece of it. So they believe the propaganda that Nasser was spreading. And they joined the war, even though they promised they wouldn't. And they begin shelling targets in West Jerusalem. They begin targeting and they begin bombing Netanya. They begin bombing the outskirts of Tel Aviv. They were warned, don't get involved in this war and we won't touch your territory. Now, this could have been interpreted either as a salvo to uphold Jordanian honor, that they just needed to show to their own people that we're not cowards, or as a declaration of war. The prime minister at the time of Israel was Levi Eshkol. And Levi Eshkol decides to give King Hussein the benefit of the doubt. And he tells his cabinet he's just doing it to save face amongst his people. He's not really getting involved in the war. Though the general of the Norwegian commander of UNTSO, he sends the following message the morning of the 5th of June. We shall not initiate any action whatsoever against Jordan. Jordan continues to bomb Israel June 5th, June 6th. General Uzi Narkis, the general of the Central Command, begs the leaders of Israel to allow him to retake the old city. Jordan is now fully engaged in this war. They're bombing us. We have every right. And Jerusalem is ours. It was taken away from us in 48. This is our time. Let's go in. We have the men. We have the force. We have the ability. Israel refuses. Who's the cabinet at the time that controls the decisions of the war? Levi Eshkol, the prime minister. Moshe Dayan, the defense minister. And the joint chief of staff, someone by the name of Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin, Dayan, and Eshkol are allergic to the idea that Israel should retake Jerusalem. They felt it would create a hazard for Israel. It would be dangerous for Israel. The world will turn against Israel. General Narkis pleads his case, but the leadership refuses. And Narkis, who's a general, listens to the command. He had to listen. Israel had no plans to retake the old city of Jerusalem in the 6-day war. So what happened? What happened? How did it change? There was a Knesset opposition member at the time. You may be familiar with his name. His name, Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin would listen to the radio at midnight, at 12 a.m., to the BBC headlines coming from London. That was his thing every single night. He wanted to know what was being said on the BBC. And he hears, this is June 7th at 12 midnight, he hears the BBC saying that tomorrow morning, the United Nations will be declaring a ceasefire. And once that ceasefire is called by the United Nations, no one will be able to make a move. He's got precious hours now. So what does Begin do? He goes to Prime Minister Eshkol's house in the middle of the night, and he bangs on the door, and he wakes Eshkol up. And he tells Eshkol, history will never forgive you for not reclaiming Judaism's eternal capital and the Temple Mount. 3,000 years of Jewish history is on your shoulders right now. King David is watching you. King Solomon is watching you. All the kings of Israel are watching you. All the prophets of Israel are watching you. This is where the divine presence dwelt. This is where two of our holy temples were. Even from a military point of view, this decision of not going into the old city was senseless. Jordan was increasing the shelling. The fighting with Jordan was fierce. Why are we tying our hands behind our back and not going into Jerusalem? If we don't enter the old city, we will never be able to stop the enemy from attacking us again and again and again. This will just continue. Eshkol tells Begin, I don't have the authority to make this decision alone. We have agreed that there will be this inner security cabinet of the government, and every decision will be made by them. And we will meet in the morning. Begin says, the morning is too late. It must be now. The order must be given now. So the prime minister got out of bed. And for the only time in Israel's history, the entire cabinet met at 3 a.m. Till this day, it was called the pajama meeting, because practically everyone was there in their pajamas. And Begin convinces the cabinet, this is the time, this is the moment. God is giving us back to Jerusalem. We must take it. After fierce fighting with the Jordanian troops in and around the Jerusalem area, Israel captures the old city on the third day of the Six-Day War in the morning of June 7th. 182 soldiers fell in the battle for Jerusalem, more than a quarter of all the Jewish casualties of the Six-Day War. And then at 10 a.m. came the resounding declaration by Mati Gur, the general of the paratroopers, Har Habayit b'yadenu. The Temple Mount is in our hands. The nation wept, the nation danced. Moshe Amirov, an Israeli paratrooper, describes his first minute at the Western Wall. We ran there, a group of panting soldiers lost on the plaza of the Temple Mount, searching for this giant stone wall. We didn't stop to look at the mosque. We were just trying to find the wall. Forward, forward. We pushed our way through the gate, and suddenly we stopped, and we were thunderstruck. There it was before our eyes, gray and massive, silent and restrained, the Western Wall. Slowly, he writes, I began to approach the wall in fear and trembling, like a pious cantor going to the lectern to lead the prayers. I approached it as the messenger of my father and my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and all of the generations, and all of the exiles who had never merited to see it. And so they sent me to represent them. Someone recited the blessing of Shechiyanu Vikimanu Vigiyanu Lasman Hazeh. I put my hands on the stones, and the tears started to flow, continued to flow and would not stop. They were tears for all of Israel, tears of hope, tears of prayer. And we started dancing. Had it not been for Jordan's rash decision and a rash middle of the night decision by Israel to act swiftly, we would not have had Jerusalem. God clearly orchestrated these events so that we would almost by mistake take back our holy city, our eternal capital. If it was up to us, we never would have gotten it. God got tired of waiting and he initiated the rebuilding of the lower Conejo. But now we have a difficult situation. As you recall from the above Mishnah, from the Talmud that we studied, in such a case, the owner of the bottom house has to reimburse the loft owner of all of expenses because God built the lower one. God gave us our home back. We have to repay him this debt to make ourselves worthy of living in the lower Conejo. Comes King David in the book of Psalms and says, nah, despite the fact that God builds Jerusalem in the present tense, nevertheless, he will in the future tense gather the outcasts of Israel. Because God is not just our neighbor, he's our father, he's our mother, he's our best friend, and he wants us back. He's not going to wait until we come up with all the cash to pay for it all. He'll go ahead, he will gather our exiles, he will gather us from all over the world, and we have seen over the last few decades how this has happened. From Russia they're coming, from the Middle East countries they're coming from all over the world. The gathering of the exiles. And he will allow us to reclaim our home as our own forever with the coming of Moshiach and the complete ingathering of all the exiles. Despite our shortcomings, notwithstanding our failures, God will bring us home. 54 years later, we ought to recommit ourselves to our historic destiny, to hold on to the physical, earthly Jerusalem, the city of light, but equally important to hold on to the spiritual Jerusalem, to rebuild Yerushalayim, where it gets its name from, the divine awe within us, the divine love, and to re-embrace our destiny as God's ambassadors of love, light, and hope through our Torah, through our mitzvahs. And indeed, we should merit the complete ingathering of the exiles, where all of us are gathered together in Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people, for the rebuilding of the third and final Beit HaMikdash, as we await the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu. It should happen speedily in our days. A good Shabbos to all. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. We look forward to seeing you Monday night. We'll have our Biblical Reflections course. Wednesday, we'll have our lunch class on the book of Deuteronomy. And then the following week, on Friday, we'll have our sermon, and the following week is the holiday of Shavuot. Everyone's invited to join us for Shavuot services this year in our outdoor sanctuary. This will be on Monday and Tuesday of the following week. We'll have a delicious lunch served for all of you. Let us all celebrate Shavuot together. Take care, everybody.